Welcome to Resilience 3, powered by FEI Workforce Resilience, building resilient workforces for more than 40 years. During the winter and spring of 2020, millions of words were written, spoken, recorded, broadcast, posted, or shared about the spread and impact of the novel coronavirus and the disease it can cause, COVID-19. We don't need to reinvent the wheel by recounting the history in detail, so we'll stick to the basics, just for some context. It's been widely reported that in late 2019, the novel coronavirus made the jump from animals to human beings in an open-air market in Wuhan, China. However, one study of hospital parking lots convinced some researchers that the virus may have been spreading widely, long before it had been identified and we had a name for it. Right away, we encounter an aspect of this situation that makes it so troubling: the amount of disagreement over even the most basic facts about the pandemic, its spread, and its implications. This very public, and in many cases highly politicized, lack of agreement on what was going on was exemplified by a basic disagreement over when the story even began. This kind of retroactive understanding of cause and consequence is part and parcel of the scientific method, not to mention history. But it can be very confusing and can greatly magnify our sense of anxiety as we try to figure out what to do to stay safe. Three of the facts that were commonly accepted caused the most concern. There was no vaccine to prevent the disease, nor treatment to cure it. The virus could be carried and spread by people who had no symptoms or whose symptoms were so mild they might not realize they were carrying a serious and potentially fatal illness. Because the virus was novel or new, as a species, humankind had no innate immunity or ability to resist it. These three facts combined to paint a grim picture of a pandemic that could possibly spread out of control, overwhelming healthcare systems. And in some places, it seemed to do exactly that. Images of overcrowded makeshift hospitals and exhausted healthcare workers became shockingly familiar from China, Italy, and New York. We live in a globally connected world where the barriers of time and geography are frequently irrelevant. Whether you believe this to be a blessing or a curse, it is a fact. When the disease began spreading in the United States is uncertain, and the first confirmed deaths were in February. The virus spread quickly, and those three facts we talked about earlier created a sense of urgency, which as March passed, resulted in sweeping changes to normal life. Schools being closed, sporting events and travel canceled, many businesses being shuttered. All of us were told to stay home whenever possible, whether we had work or not, and the very nature of social interactions changed for the foreseeable future. Whole segments of the global and national economies ground to a virtual halt, with no clear understanding of what would come next. You have no doubt heard the word unprecedented used to describe the situation in 2020. Yet, as we consider and create the new world of work we will re-enter, it's worth remembering that there is precedent for what we're living through. The flu pandemic of 1918 through 1919, often incorrectly called the Spanish flu, there's some evidence that it may have begun in Kansas, is a very harrowing precedent. 500 million people, 1/3 of the world's population at the time, was sickened. Fatality estimates range from a low of 20 million to some estimates of more than 100 million. Many of the horrifying possibilities of COVID-19 were played out. Overwhelmed healthcare systems, hospitals filled to overflowing, entire families wiped out, bodies stacking up with no one to bury them. Nobody alive now remembers any of that directly, but the horror history tells of is part of what traumatizes us today. That is a precedent, and it is terrifying. It's worth remembering that our understanding of infectious disease has improved dramatically in the past 100 years. Back then, doctors didn't even know for certain what caused the flu, and had only the vaguest ideas of how to prevent its spread. However, there was at least some awareness of the benefits of non-pharmaceutical interventions such as isolation, quarantine, good personal hygiene, and limits of public gatherings. In other words, there's nothing new about social distancing. We don't only have to think about diseases to understand how traumatic and stressful the pandemic has been, and how we will likely be living with the impact of that trauma and stress for a long time. On the morning of September 11, 2001, 4 coordinated attacks were launched on targets in the United States, successfully striking the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives in a matter of minutes. Many watched in horror on television as the Pentagon burned and the towers of the World Trade Center collapsed. Our entire concept of America's place in the world and what it meant to be safe in our homes changed that day. Certainly, geopolitically, the world has never been the same. You might be tempted to argue that there's no comparison between the deliberate actions of terrorists and the behavior of a virus. Clearly, pathogens are not homicidal ideologists. What is most relevant here is not the immediate nature of the events themselves, but rather the impact of the event on us and the people with whom we work, and how we will adapt as we return to work to places that will be vastly different than we left them. We have been terrorized by the novel coronavirus and its impact on our society. Even more recently, we can look back at the financial crisis that began in 2008. No direct attacks motivated by malice, no virus being transmitted and making us sick, but the loss of security and faith represented by the collapse of our financial system was also terrorizing in its own way, and left us as a society unsure, fearful, and in many cases unemployed and financially damaged. The unknown is, broadly speaking, one of the most unsettling concepts for the human mind. We plan our lives and live our days with a certain, arguably illusory, sense of control and predictability that allows us to function quite successfully most of the time. But when traumatic events or disasters or pandemics occur, they violate this sense of control and cause untold anxiety and suffering. But as with the precedents for trauma, there are also precedents, many precedents, for recovery, growth, and healing. Our precedents, the historical twists and turns that have led us here, have to do with how we must learn to adapt and exist in the future we are facing. How to find hope. What does make this situation different is the isolation forced upon many of us, the extended period of time we've had to live with these stresses, and the doubts about the future, about our well-being, physical, emotional, and financial. The suffering through illness and loss of life due to COVID-19 has been horrific and tragic. What we do know is that there will be a new normal, a new world to go to work in, even if the world looks a lot different than the one we were sent home from. To learn more, visit learning.resilience3.com.